Hey guys, so good to see you here in small groups. I'm really excited that you are here tonight for our small group time together. Hope you guys had a chance to catch up and see how the week was treating you. For me, it was a pretty busy one. We are, of course, back to school, back to meeting on Tuesday night, so getting super busy in my life. But I'm really excited for the word for tonight. I really think that this series is going to be a really, really powerful one. In this series, if you guys weren't here last week, what we're doing is we're talking all about how we can love God and love others. The two commandments that Jesus says are the most important part. But when Jesus says for us to love God and love others, he says for us to love God with all of our heart, with all of our mind, with all of our strength, with all of our soul. And what Jesus is talking about is he's saying every single part of us, everything that makes you, you, everything that makes me who I am, can be used to love God and to love other people. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at all the different parts of us and how each one of those we can use to love God and love others. Tonight, we are talking about our minds, the power of our minds, and how we can use them to love God and love others. And when I think about how, powerful your mind is, I think back to the time when I was your guys' age in junior high. It's going to UStack, and I was a part of Science Olympiad, right? And so what I would do is, that's pretty much like a competition for people who are good at science, right? And so I was on the team, and we had to go to travel out of town to another college in order for our competition to happen. And so the morning of, we're driving over there, it's a couple-hour drive, and the whole time I am just thinking about, what if I do a bad job? What if I just fail miserably? What kind of things did I not do that maybe I should have done? And all these thoughts were going through my head, and I was just spinning and spinning and spinning. And we get to the college, and I just feel so overwhelmed in my mind that it actually started to impact the way I felt. I was actually very sick to my stomach, and I ended up being sick, kind of throwing up in some bushes. I was so nervous about what was coming up, and my mind was just racing and racing and racing about all these worst case scenarios, all of the failure that could happen. Everybody's laughing at, like, all this stuff that is not in any way going to happen. But my mind was just running and running and running, and it affected the rest of my body. And I think when we realize like how powerful our thinking can be, and we realize how powerful our mind can be, that we can treat it the way it needs to be treated. Because if we don't control maybe our thoughts, then we might be just caught in the waves of what it wants to do with our emotions or with the physical health that we have, right? Like, our mind is so powerful. Well, let me throw a question to your small group, though, that is a little bit better than the story I just shared. What are some things you think are fun to think about? Well, that's kind of redundant. What do you like to think about? Do you like to think about these crazy scenarios? Like, one of the things that's really fun for me to think about is, like, I would take like two random animals and just be like, who would win in a fight between like a giraffe and I don't know, some kind of bird or something like that, right? Like, there's like weird things that we think about. But for you, what are some fun things that you like to think about? Talk about that in your small group, and we'll come back in a second. Well, I hope that sparked some good conversation for you guys. There's plenty of other stuff that I like to think about, like what would it look like to live on the moon? Like, what if I was born in the 1920s? What if, I don't know, I don't know why I picked 1920s either. All this like random stuff can be really fun to think about. Or what if I had a different job? Sometimes I think, what if I worked on like an oil rig? Or what if fun stuff like that to think about. And that's like pretty harmless, pretty good stuff to think about, but in our lives, there's lots of maybe sometimes serious or maybe more scary things for us to think about, right? Like, if we are thinking about our future, sometimes that can make us pretty nervous, especially as you get older and there's these more paths for you to take, more choices. You start to think about, well, my future, what's it going to look like? Or maybe for you, you're like, oh man, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And there could be some really serious things for us to think about. Or we can turn kind of internally. We can start to think about all the time, well, what do other people think of me? I think that's a really big, dangerous thought pattern that we can have is everything we do, what does someone else think about this? Or do people really even like me? And there's really, really powerful things for us to think about. Well, when the Bible talks about our mind, and when it talks about how we can use our mind actually to love God and to love other people, it really understands that the mind can be a really amazing thing for us to think about good things, think about what is about God and what has to do with others. We could think about other people and how to bless them. And there's really good stuff. It could be really scary things as well, like all these dangerous and kind of scary things maybe for us to think about. And where I want to go first, when we're looking at how do we love God with our mind, where I want to go first is Romans 12. All right, Romans 12. If you guys have a Bible, you can go there. We're just going to be starting in verse 1. And Paul, before we jump into it, Paul is a guy who knows what it's like to have to change everything about him to love God, to love other people. Paul used to be Saul, if you remember, and Saul hated the church. He hated followers of Jesus. He wanted to stop them. And then when Jesus showed up in his life and changed his life, now Paul had to change the way he thought, the way he felt, change what he said, change what he did, change his identity. I mean, everything was changed when Paul met Jesus, especially his mind. So in Romans, when he's writing this letter to this church in the big city in Rome, he mentions that our relationship with Jesus should change our minds. And this is what he says in Romans 12. I'm going to read just 2 verses, and I want you to really focus on the second verse, okay? He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Now, here's the one I want you to focus on. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, just that second verse I want us to focus on because there's a lot in there that we could take away from it. The first thing that I see in here, Paul's saying, don't be conformed to this world. There's a lot of stuff in life that the world, and whenever Paul says the world, he just means like the influences around us. So maybe it's like social media influences at school, influences in the news, in all this kind of stuff in the world. Don't be conformed to it. And conformed means don't change yourself to look like it. You know, a lot of people around you might be thinking about, they might be really thinking about who am I going to date, and I have to be in a relationship, and this is the most important thing to me. So they're always thinking about that. And is just really not something you have to worry about right now, right? And there's other things for people today that they want to think about. Think about how to do what they want to do and the way they want to do it. And Paul's saying, don't change yourself to be like that. Don't conform and match up with what the world thinks about. But instead, he says, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. He's talking about this process of changing your mind. And it can happen every single day. You have to renew it, right? To get a brand new mind almost every single day. And there's a couple of ways we do that for us to renew our mind. Number one, we just renew our mind when we follow Jesus and we have the Holy Spirit. He actually helps us renew our minds. When I'm walking with Jesus, the things I think about are very, very different than when I'm not walking really close to Jesus. Let me give you an example. So whenever I walk really close to Jesus and I'm really focused on my relationship with him, I will think about things and maybe someone will do something to me and I'll think about it and just say, you know what? I bet you they're just having a rough time. I bet you they're not having a good day. I forgive them and I just want to love on them and serve them. Whereas if I'm not walking very close to Jesus that day, somebody does something to me, I might be thinking, why would they do that to me? How could they do that to me? I can't believe they did that. I'm going to push them away. I'm going to shun them. Maybe I'll get them back. my thought pattern completely changes, right? When I was doing some missions work, I was in this place called Nepal, right next to India, and we were building a house there. And we were building a house, not at all like you do today, but we were building a house with bricks, these big cinder block bricks, and like cement mud that we were laying out, right? And so it was really hard work. It was very hot. It was very humid. It was like during the summer. And so it was pretty tough. And when I was really close to Jesus during some weeks, I had all this patience. I had all this grace. I was showing mercy to people. Somebody would do something, I'd be like, don't worry about it. My thinking was totally different than when I wasn't walking close to Jesus for a couple days. I wasn't doing my Bible study. I wasn't really praying too much for a couple days because I was getting tired, and I let it affect me instead of pushing through and focusing on my relationship with Jesus. And I started to get a little bit more grumpy, started to get a little bit less forgiving, a little bit less patient. And I was just thinking about people differently. I would see somebody working and I'd be like, man, why aren't they helping me right now? Or I see someone taking a break, like, why aren't they getting to work? Instead of thinking about it and saying, oh man, they really need a break, like they've been working hard all these days. My thinking really does change when I spend more time with Jesus. So another question thrown over to your group, what are some other ways that you think that God wants you to renew your mind? What are some other ways that you can spend time with God in order to change how you might think about situations or think about even following Him? Talk about that in your group. All right, so there's one other place that I want to take us to. It's Paul again. He's writing to a different church this time, and he's talking about what we should be thinking about. Some of us have these patterns in our thinking where we start to go downhill pretty fast, right? Like we start to really spiral out of control when we start thinking about different things. And I know that there's been times in my life where that's happened to me. And Paul, like I said, again, in a different letter, different church, he's still writing about thinking because he knows how powerful our minds are. And this is what he says in Philippians 4. You don't have to turn there this time. We'll have it up as I read it. But Philippians 4 says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. He says we should choose to think about the good stuff around us, right, in life. Because if we choose to focus on and think about the good things that are around us, that doesn't mean that we're like all of a sudden blind or that we don't think anything's bad. Like we're just like skipping through, fires all around us and we're like, oh, I love this, beautiful sky we have, and there's like fire going on around us. That's not what I'm talking about. It just means that when we focus on the good or the godly things that are around us, it will help us to love other people. Because if you look at some of these things he talks about things that are honorable, whatever's just, pure, lovely, or what's commendable. Some of these things that he's talking about relate to what other people might do. And I think about how big of a difference it would make in your life if you, let's just throw out a random example. Let's say you have your siblings that get on your nerves, annoy you, bother you, make you not be able to sleep at night because your siblings are just that crazy. Do you think your relationship with your sibling, if you have one, and if you don't, you can imagine what a sibling's like. Do you think your relationship with your sibling would change if you thought about the good stuff that they did instead of the bad stuff? Right? So like an example for me, my younger brother and I were super close. We're 2.5 years apart, but he's taller than me, I'm older than him, and we like all the same stuff. We like the same video games. We like to listen to the same music. We like to watch the same shows, and all this stuff. We're very, very similar. But just because we're similar doesn't mean we always get along. And there's been tons of times in my life where my brother, he gets on my nerves, he bothers me, he does something that I'm like, I can't believe he did that. Kind of get offended about it. Maybe he says like a joke or something that kind of cuts me a little bit. And I know for sure that if I choose to focus on the good things about him, it would really help me love him better, right? Because we're called to love all people, to love our neighbors. Back to what Jesus said. Remember, we talked about that last week. Love your neighbor as yourself. Second greatest commandment we have. And so if you focus on the good stuff, not ignoring the bad stuff, but you just choose to think more about the good stuff, it really will change the way that you're able to love the people around you. And this is really just a game changer. That's what Paul is talking about here. He's saying if you are able to control your mind, if you're able to renew it, if you're able to think about these good things that you see around you, it will really, really help you in loving God and loving others. So 2 takeaways for you guys. But before we do that, I want you guys to talk about in your small group, what are some things that your friends or your parents or your siblings do that's good, but you don't really maybe think about it or notice it. I'll give you an example, right? So for my wife and I, there are lots of things that she does to help me in life that I don't sometimes even realize, but if I really thought about it, I'd probably notice. I came back from a trip the other day, and she had just had an opportunity to kind of do the dishes, which is the chore that I have at the house, one of the chores that I have, of course, at the house. But she had done them. And I could have just walked by the sink, I could have seen it, and been like, cool. And I could have seen maybe something else that she did and been like, oh my goodness, I can't believe she didn't do that. Instead of focusing on what she did do. So for you, what are some things that your siblings or parents or friends do that's good, that you could think about and you could even say thank you to them for it, but you just might not realize it? Talk about that in your group. So let's wrapping it up here with really, really practical, some steps that we can do to do it. If our mind really is powerful, if the Bible really thinks that we can love God with all of our mind and that we can love other people through our minds, through what we think about, if it's really powerful, what do? Well, I think the first thing that we can do to help renew our minds, maybe you guys talked about this in your group, but one of the things that we could do to renew our minds is to just spend time with Jesus. And the whole story of Jesus, the best way to do that is in the Bible, right? This is all about Jesus from start to finish. And if you read the story of Jesus, and if you read these letters from Paul, if you even read the Old Testament, you can see what God is like. And the more you spend time with somebody, the more you start to think like them, right? There's been tons of times where I will say the same thing, same phrase that my best friend says all the time. Or there's times where I'll be hanging out with somebody a bunch, and then all of a sudden they'll say something like, oh, I was just thinking about that, or I was just thinking about that story, or that reference to our favorite show together or something, right? The more time you spend with somebody, you start to kind of think more like them. So when we spend time with God in His Word, we can start to think more like Jesus. And that's going to help us for the second thing. How can we love others better with our minds? I think we have to choose to be people who focus on what is good and what is godly in other people instead of the negative and the bad things. When we see our friends and we see good things in them, and especially when we then tell them that, hey, I noticed you had a really hard day, but you were able to, make it through, or you were still treating me with respect, or all these different things. If we focus on that and we call that out to people, then it will help us love them more. So those are just 2 practical steps for us to spend time with God so we could think more like Him, and for us to focus and choose to think about what's good in people that are around us. It will really help us to love God, to love others with our minds. And I hope that you guys have a good rest of your night. There's a few more questions for you guys to talk about. And if you guys didn't notice, maybe you weren't paying attention, a few things in the room changed during the video. So maybe start off thinking if you noticed anything that changed during the video, and also talk about these questions with your small group leader. Love you guys. Hope to see you next week. We're talking about the heart. Oh boy, it's going to be a good one. See ya.